Hello, you're listening to Storytelling Saga, the podcast that shares stories. I'm your host, Allie, and this week I'm absolutely thrilled to welcome Kevin Manthei to the podcast. Welcome, Kevin.
Hey, Allie, how's it going?
Going well. So I wanted to start by asking you, Kevin, what were some of your musical influences growing up?
I, interestingly enough, was interested in heavy metal, but also orchestral music. So I grew up listening to John Williams Star Wars records on my dad's turntable. And then in the eighth grade, I really started to get into popular music. And for whatever reason, I gravitated more towards heavier music. So classic radio, like Led Zeppelin, The Who, and bands like that. But then also like what was kind of happening in the 80s was like Motley Crue at their first records, and then started to get into Metallica as they came along, and Anthrax. And so I really identified with just sort of those really cool guitar riffs and just sort of the sound and vibe of that music. But also there was this other side of me that really loved the emotional aspect of music. And I think that's where I heard that from, like watching television scores from like Starsky and Hutch to Chips to all these classic 80s TV dramas that my dad and I would watch, to epic Star Wars orchestral music that John Williams did so beautifully. So it was kind of a hodgepodge of things that I was really interested in. For whatever reason, even though I loved synthesizers, I just really couldn't stand 80s synthwave, 80s music in general. That was more popular at the time, although I loved U2 and the Police and that kind of stuff. More band-centric things I liked. But when it got too poppy and too syrupy, I really didn't identify with it.
Oh, interesting. That's really cool. That's cool that you had a whole array of different things. As you mentioned, orchestra. That's really nice. And so what are some of your favorite instruments to play, like maybe starting out too and then throughout all the years for you?
Well, I started playing piano. That was my first instrument. And then immediately after that, I picked up trumpet and played trumpet in band in high school and in junior high, and started in like fifth grade. So I really loved just, the one nice thing about the trumpet is you can play really loud. So, I think I was drawn to just really playing loud, and also with playing piano, that obviously that can be a really loud instrument as well. So I just enjoyed like just banging really loud and making crazy sounds, and then also just being soft and gentle with it and coaxing out these really beautiful emotions with the piano.
Yeah, piano, that's my favorite instrument. I started playing regularly when I was 13, but actually in school I played the glockenspiel, so like similar, the bells. So yeah.
That's cool. I think that would have been fun to play percussion. I think that's one thing that I think I would be really had been fun, because percussionists get to play so many different instruments. You could be on the bass drum one time, and then all of a sudden you're over at the xylophone, and then you're doing the cymbals and doing the snare drum. It's a lot of different things.
That's true, yeah. And then it's funny how as kids everyone has to for some reason play the recorder though, Did you do that too?
And those,
right?
Yeah. Squeak so easy. All my kids played the recorder growing up, in school, and if you don't play it gentle enough, you just pick it squeaks. So it's actually a pretty hard instrument to learn in some regards.
You're right. Yeah, it definitely has like certain breath control with that, besides like learning the notes and everything.
Yeah, breath control, right? Exactly. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so going into like your career now, so how did you get your start? Like I know you started scoring video games. How did that come about for you?
Well, I'll give you a little background in my music and my education. So I grew up playing the piano and guitar, piano and trumpet. And that I just really felt led to study music in a more professional way at the university. So I grew up in Minnesota, applied for the theory and composition program at the University of Minnesota undergrad. And I did that. And during those 4 years, it was really great just to be able to study music, to learn about music history, to learn about where I am at as a composer in the history of the world of composers, and to kind of realize that famous composers like Beethoven and Bach and Haydn and all these composers, they worked a lot of times either as a composer for a king or for a court or for a church, and they would get paid to do that. That was kind of their job. And so I realized that in school, I realized that composers these days that get paid to write music are sort of modern court composers of the modern age. So I realized that I wanted to be a modern court composer, just like these famous composers that I was studying that were making a living writing music. And so that sort of drew me towards, well, what is it that I love writing for? And I've always loved writing music for emotions. So emotionally based music is best described as writing film score music, or as, this was like the late 80s, early 90s, and soon became video game music. So I really was drawn towards film scores. Like I said, I was really into John Williams at the time and his Star Wars scores and other scores, and just helping tell a story with music. So all of those thoughts were going in my head and trying to figure out, like, what in the world am I going to do after 4 years of studying music and composition? Where am I going to land? How do I make a living doing this? And so that led me to California, where I went to USC and got accepted into a small program. It's called Scoring for Motion Pictures and Television. It's one of the best programs in the country for learning how to write music for film, television, and video games. And it's a 1-year program. It might be 2 years now, I'm not sure, but it was a 1-year program at the time that I went, and for most of the years thus far. And it was there that I really got to hone in on writing music for media and for film and TV, and just honing in on what it means to, write to picture and to write music that would be correct for a video game. So some of the teachers that we had that year, we were very fortunate. We had Jerry Goldsmith, who was just an infamous composer of, the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. He taught for the 1 year that I was there. We got really fortunate. We had other great composers like David Raksin, who actually, David Raksin's first job was to help Charlie Chaplin with one of his films. Wow. So we're going all the way back either in the 20s or 30s, and here's this young David Raksin who was orchestrating and composing on a Charlie Chaplin film. And fast forward to the early 90s, he's teaching us, as an older gentleman, he's teaching us about how to score films. And that just blew my mind. So that program was really amazing, and I met some great friends, and a lot of the people that were in my year have gone on to really have amazing careers, like Marco Beltrami and Christoph Beck. And so all of that to say that once I was finished with USC and the Scoring for Motion Pictures and TV program, I was then thrust into my last school, which I like to call the School of Hard Knocks, which is, the school where you have that degree in your hand and you're like, okay, how do I parlay this into actual work in the industry? So through USC, I made a lot of good connections with people that I did short films for, and people that like Marco and Chris that I struck up relationships with. So I started doing some work for them, some additional music work, and then assistant work and doing score preparation and copying work and all kinds of anything that was music related, I was game to do. And then also I started branching out and really starting to send my demo out to various companies. And through my networking, I ran into a team of sound effects and composers that were actually out of Minnesota, because I'm from Minnesota. And they were doing different music for video games. And I was like, wow, so video games aren't bleeps and bloops anymore like they were in the 80s? Even though those were awesome bleeps and bloops, which when we look at Nintendo and how amazing they did with that technology, I was thrust into this world of video game music. So these guys, they hired me to write the music for the Indian in the Cupboard video game that was based on the Paramount feature film at the time, a children's feature film. So it was a company called Viacom New Media. That was the very first game that I scored. And I just fell in love with the medium. And, here I was coming out of USC thinking I would be scoring for film and television, but this whole new genre of music and ways to express yourself as a composer came out of that, which is video games. So that's kind of the CD-ROM era. We had all these famous or infamous games coming out of like Sierra Online, like the King's Quest series, which I scored, I think the last King's Quest game, which was number 8, I scored. There were other games, like a lot of military-based games for a company called SSI, Strategic Simulations. And the second game I ever scored was Panzer General 2, and that was these turn-based simulation games based on the different world wars and whatnot. So I just loved writing music for games. And so that's kind of the long story of how I got involved, in my industry and in video games.
That's really, really cool. And so, obviously, I know you've worked on an array of different things. I'm curious to know if there is a difference between, say, scoring for video games versus shows and movies, or does it just start from, as you mentioned, like emotion and action and story?
Yeah, so there's a lot of similarities, but then there's differences too. The big difference, I think, is that when you're writing for film and TV, you know exactly what you're writing for because you have the picture or the movie or the animated show in front of you, and you get to score exactly to picture. So if there's a big action sequence, your action sequence music will stop when, suddenly the car crashes. But in a video game, let's say you're writing something for combat or action. Well, you can write what dictates the beginning and end is more like what the audio director or whoever you're working with says, well, we need a 2-minute loop, or we need a 2-minute segment. So your music really ends at the 2 minutes. And then in video game music, you want to create it so that the piece of music, so that when it goes to the very end, it seamlessly will start playing again at the beginning. That's called a loop. There's no loops. There's no loops in, film and TV. And with video game music, it's a kind of a freeing thing because you can just really let the music carry you to where the music wants to go. So if I have a really epic melody and I'm like, oh, I just want to keep going with this melody, I want to see where it goes, you can just keep going with it, until maybe the end of the piece. Whereas in film and TV, you might have a really great melody, and maybe at some point in the series or show, you're going to do that full melody, but a lot of times because of whatever's happening on screen, you got to kind of end it or abbreviate it or whatever. The other thing about video games is that you kind of get a sense of what you're writing for based on screenshots or maybe rough video they send you of the level, but you never quite know exactly what it's going to be like until the video game is released, and then you play it through yourself and you're listening to your music as you play the game.
And so I'm curious if you can kind of give an overview of, I'm sure obviously it varies depending on the project, but with TV in particular, if you can kind of give an overview of scoring an episode of TV.
So I'll give an example. Let's say I'll give an example of Marvel's Spider-Man, which is one of the more recent shows I've worked on. Typically, we'll have a spotting session with the producer, usually the supervising producer, and we'll do that either in person or over Zoom, and we'll watch the episode together. And then we start and stop throughout the entire half an hour episode. And, I'll ask questions, he'll ask questions, he or she will ask questions. And we just kind of go back and forth trying to find the right fit of what's the music have to say here? Should there be music here? If there is music, what's the story? If there's any questions I have about story, I'll ask those. A lot of times we have various themes. We can say, okay, this is a great Spider-Man theme section, or let's do that Venom theme here. Sometimes it's obvious, and then other times it's really great just to have that conversation and to be able to explore ideas, options. Sometimes the producer says, hey, for this, I remember for, I think, Venom, there was some ideas thrown around or some various episodes where this epic goth orchestral metal band is really a cool inspiration for this scene. What do you think? And then we share YouTube links, and check those out, and I'm like, yeah, that sounds like a great idea. Let's go for it. So there's a lot of give and take with that. And every producer, every director is different. Some people you get to a point where if you're doing episodic, it might be a 5-minute phone call. It might be 10 minutes. It might be an hour and a half. It just really depends on, their comfort level and kind of what they feel like they want to put into it and what they feel like they need to put into it. So once I've spotted the show, then it's just time to score the show. And I typically will, like an 11-minute episode, usually I score in a week. And there'll maybe be 7 or 8 minutes of music per 11-minute episode. Sometimes the 22-minute episodes, which are 30 minutes with commercials. Sometimes I get 2 weeks for those. Sometimes I get 1 week for those. It just really depends. And so some days you have to really crank out the minutes, and other days you can really just relax a little bit and write a couple minutes of music per day, and you'll hit your deadline. So it's all deadline based, and I try to put as much time and effort into each episode as I possibly can, given my deadline and the time involved. So then once I've done my first pass, I create what's called a music preview, like a quick time with the video. And oh, by the way, too, I'm usually given a locked picture, which means like the editor is done editing, because, music is for film and TV is so dependent on what's happening on screen. If suddenly they're like, oh, let's just have this scene start 2 seconds earlier, or this thing, half a frame or 5 frames later, and all these things, you start editing, all these little minor edits turn into like, suddenly your music that you've written on version 1 is completely not fitting or hitting or working with version 2. So generally in animation, we get final locked picture. There's no sound effects that are in yet. It's generally it's mostly final picture, but not completely final picture. It's locked for time. And then all the mostly final dialogue is in there. Sometimes you'll hear some random person saying Spider-Man's line because they have to pick up a line later. But for the most part, it's pretty much finished in the sense that you really get a full sense of what's going on. So then you write the music to the picture. I create a music preview, send that off to the client, and then they'll give any feedback, and then I do another round of revisions, and then create my final stems and final files and send those to the mixing stage, and then they mix the show.
Nice, that's really cool. And so then I'm sure obviously because you're always working though, do you get a chance to watch some of your stuff and be like, do you,
Yeah.
once it's out there, are you just kind of like, okay, that's what it is? Or do you judge yourself, I guess is my roundabout way of saying that? Or are you generally usually happy with how things turn out?
Sure. Well, so what's always really hard for composers, and myself included, is that we're not in charge of the final mix between the music, the dialogue, and the sound effects. So that's the producer and the people mixing all of those elements together. That final stage, composers, a lot of times we're invited and can go to those mixes. So depending on your relationship with the producers and directors, you can say, hey, what do you think about maybe raising the music here? Or, I'm not really, I did this thing here, but I'm not hearing it. So those kind of things always play into it. But other than sort of the mix of the music, sometimes I'll listen to something back and I'll be really happy. Other times I'll be like, oh, I think I could have done something different there, or maybe I should have done a little bit more. Those kind of things. I mean, that's natural to do. I don't really love listening back to the broadcast or the very final necessarily, because it never sounds as good as it does in my studio. Because in my studio, it's just the music with the dialogue. And there's very rarely sound effects. If they are, they're very minor and sort of temporary. And then always just the studio sounds better than just home audio systems in general. A lot of times shows will be broadcast over the network, like over cable. And so they kind of have to compress them, and everything just gets a little bit not as good. It's kind of like listening to your music, listening to Spotify in a really good pair of headphones versus in your car. Car is never as satisfying headphones, if you got a good pair of headphones, it's pretty awesome.
Very true, like with the bass or anything, yeah. I'm actually curious too to know, like just with TV or anything in general again, like is it difficult, say, going from a more comedic thing to maybe a more dramatic moment, or is it all just that you just know it's about serving the story?
Yeah, serving the story, that's a great line. It is all
Yeah.
about that. And some of the shows that I do, like, we approach comedy different. So, like on Ben 10, it can be a little more slapstick. It can be the music will flourish and be a little more comedic and maybe slightly more cartoony. And then in Ultimate Spider-Man and Marvel Spider-Man that I both scored, a lot of times what we do is we'll clear for the joke. So we'll play music right up to the joke. We'll let the joke sort of play silently. And so those are kind of all, like, those are the things that you talk about when you're spotting and when you're creating a style and a sound for a show. You kind of come to this sort of shorthand of what you're going to do with the music and how the producers and the creators of the show want it to sound.
I do love how music can amplify anything, can amplify the comedy, the emotion, drama, all of that. So I do want to get into, of course, Invader Zim, which I'm a big fan of Invader Zim. So,
Yeah.
how did you come to get involved with that project to begin with?
So the original Invader Zim, all of 19, 20 years ago. So this is a great story. So remember I was telling you I was at USC and studying film scoring. So I did a bunch of student films. One of them I did was for a girl named Anna. And she, fast forward 3 or 4 years, maybe more like 5 years, she was working at Nickelodeon as an assistant to the executive producer on Invader Zim. And the creator, Jonan Vasquez, was really into video games and still is. He's a huge gamer. And he was like, I think they had someone already had scored the pilot and wasn't feeling it. And he was like, I just want someone that's got a more of a video game vibe to their music. Just like, let's not go with an animation composer. I mean, I hate hearing that now because it's like I am, one of the things I love doing is animation. And so it's like, I hate to sort of be judged like, oh, I'm an animation composer. But what he wanted was more of a video game composer. So she searched for video game composers and my name popped up along with a bunch of other people, but she remembered me because I scored her film. So she reached out and I submitted. At that time, I had done a bunch of additional music on like the Scream series of Dimension films for Miramax. So I had done a bunch of horror stuff and had a lot of pretty edgy music. And they kind of told me about the cartoon and kind of what they were going for. And so I just really sent them some very cinematic, dark music. And they really resonated with it. They really, really liked it. And so then they asked me to do a couple test scenes. So I just scored it the way I would, like, honestly, I scored it like the way I would have, like, something from the Scream movies and just something from a very more of a cinematic point of view. And they really liked it and resonated with it. I actually have the 3 up on my SoundCloud if anyone wants to check it out. I have the music that I wrote for my demo up there. You can hear exactly what I wrote. And actually, a lot of what I wrote really does sound like the music from the series. So that's kind of how I got involved with Invader Zim. And after I scored those 2 or 3 test sections, they really wanted to go with me and hire me for the show.
The music, honestly, is one of my favorite things about this show because I love how it has the horror elements to it, the mechanical stuff to it, and again, like the silly stuff too, which is great.
Yeah. Yeah. So Jonan and I, he's probably one of my most favorite persons to work for, and he's so much fun when we spot music. He has such great ideas, and he's such a great collaborator. One of the things that we always talked about, and he always really wanted me to know, was that when we're silly, we're really, really silly. And when we're serious, we're really, really serious. And so that the music plays at a very cinematic level, but it also plays at the same time. It can play at a comedic level. When it's ultra silly, of course it's very silly. And it's more kind of cartoony silly, but over the top cartoony silly, which makes it, I think, even funnier. But then on the dramatic side, when it's very, very dramatic, it's super cinematic. It's cool. You're like, oh, this is so cool. But then at the same time, you kind of can laugh and chuckle. And so that's just really the genius of Invader Zim, I think, and just allowing me to sort of help, come alongside it.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's really awesome. And I mean, I could just sit here and like point to some of my favorites and everything, but do you have any personal favorites from the series in particular? Favorite songs, I should say.
You know, uh, I just have to say, since you're doing this podcast and it's relevant to now, I just wanted to share that what I'm doing is I'm actually going through all of my original music and I'm creating suites of music. So I've released about 3 or 4, I believe, on YouTube so far. And I'm going to release the entire series of Invader Zim as suites. So what that means is there'll be a different YouTube video for each episode, and the music will be from the first cue to the very end cue in order of how it was in the episode, with just nice little fades in between each one. So it'll kind of play like a long 10 to 15 minute piece of music. So I'm really excited about that. So me and my assistant have been working on that the last few weeks. And so I've been listening back, and a lot of times what kind of catches me are like just these funny like source cues that I would write, source music, like the Tacos Baby song, and sort of silly ones where I would pitch my voice up octaves, high octaves, and it's just like this crazy over the top kind of vocal stuff. And then there's sort of serious, really cool like sci-fi and industrial like Planet Jackers. But I think for me, some of the ones that really resonate are the earlier episodes like Dark Harvest, Bestest Friends, and some of the more serious and also the silly stuff, and even like the most horrible Xmas ever, the very last thing I scored, that has such an emotional feeling to me too, because it was just the end of this amazing, really quick era of not that many episodes that we scored that were created, because Invader Zim, I think, just didn't get a fair shake and was picked up for a second season, then it was canceled in the middle of the second season, and it was all like a big shock to us. So having to score that last Christmas episode was pretty cool and special.
That sounds amazing, having those suites. I'm like excited to listen to them.
Yeah. You'll have to check out the first 3 that are already up on my webpage.
Cool. Okay, I'll link to them for sure too, so people can check them out. So yeah, me personally, I really love just the first song in the first episode in the beginning, and The Nightmare Begins, like that first song that throws you into the world. Yeah, I think that's fantastic, setting the tone really of the whole thing. And I mentioned to you, I love the Ultra PP theme. It's so funny. I love that one. How do you determine like when you want to include lyrics too? Is that like a discussion with Jonan or your own instincts?
There wasn't a whole lot of lyrics. I think on the Ultra PP it was just like, Ultra PP. And so that's again where I would like, I'm not really a singer, but he'd be like, oh, it'd be really cool if it did this or that. And so I would just use my own voice, and I would always pitch like entire octaves, entire octave down, entire octave up. And I'd layer my voice, add effects to it until it was just either kind of funny or sort of cool. Yeah, and then the beginning, the Irkin theme that I created for in the beginning, I'll tell you a little story about that. For whatever reason, and this is not advisable, but our very first spotting session at Nickelodeon was me, I think the post-production supervisor, Jonan, and then the sound effects editor, the person who was going to create all the sound effects. And this was actually my first animated show I've ever worked on. So this was all new to me. I didn't know what, proper protocol was or whatever. But when we got to the meeting, we went through the entire episode, and Jonan would talk about sound effects, then he'd talk about music, then go to sound effects, music. And when Jonan was talking about the kind of music or the kind of sound effects he wanted for that really beginning of the very first episode, he was just like, oh, I want this huge explosion and this huge thing, and everything was huge and grandiose. And so I was thinking in my head as a composer, I'm like, okay, well, the sound effects have to just be so big and so huge. So I'll just kind of bring the music down. I won't be so big and huge with the music because, big and huge plus big and huge equals too big in my mind, right? Well, so I submit my version 1, and he's like, it needs to be bigger. It needs to be huge. And so it was a great lesson to learn, but what I learned was you can't worry about what the sound effects are going to be doing. You have to understand and know that they're going to be there, but it's really the director, the creator, the producer's choice what they're going to feature at the mix stage. So I needed it to be really awesome, really huge, really dramatic, really cinematic. And it is not my job to worry about the sound effects and to worry about, oh no, like my music might cover the sound effects or whatever. So that's a little inside story.
And I do also really love the closing theme song too. I just love that one too. It's great.
Yeah, that was really fun. I could tell you a little bit about the main title. So Jonan's friend, Mark, and I'm going to murder his last name, Tortolini. I don't know. I didn't say it right. So Mark T, I'll call him, is a composer, and he had written a theme for the pilot and a theme that Jonan really, really liked, but he wasn't feeling like it was exactly produced the way he wanted it. So I came in and took Mark's really cool theme and then kind of orchestrated it more along the lines of what I was doing in the show. And so that's kind of how the main theme came along. So I'm not credited as composer on the main theme, but it sounds like me because it's my arrangement. And then the end credits is fully me. And that was just really fun and just like, just threw everything at the wall there just to make it huge and big and very kind of cinematic, but really very synthy sounding too, very sci-fi synth heavy.
Right. Mm-hmm. I've literally listened to the theme song like with headphones to like get myself pumped for stuff. Like, it's too fun. I really have. Cool. Yeah, for real. It's like, oh yeah, okay. I need to like. It's a good theme song to like get you motivated. Yeah. I feel, or like make you feel powerful and whatnot. And
there's some really cool covers of the theme on YouTube. It's always really fun to hear those. Some good metal covers and whatnot. Just people kind of just experimenting. I've also heard some good orchestral mock-ups, which are, in other words, like synthesized orchestral music doing the themes, and that's fun to hear too.
And I do want to ask you, what was it like stepping back into the world of Invader ZIM years later when you came back to score Enter the Florpus?
Yeah, wow, that was just incredible. It was a little daunting in a strange way because anytime you step back into something after a long time, you've changed as an artist and you've grown up and all the equipment has changed, and it's like, well, how do I create that sound again? What do I keep? What do I change? How do we move the sound forward? How do we be respectful of that sound and of Invader ZIM? So it was like this balancing act of like, what do we do new? What do we stay the same? And Jonan was really great with that because I think, like, for example, on Invader ZIM's March music, it's very simple. And it's like, dun, 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 and maybe I was making it go like, dun, 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 dun. I was making it too much. And so he'd be like, let's just keep it simple. Remember, we used to do it. It was just very simple. It was very martial. It was not overly complex. And I think you're just, you're putting too much into it. So I had to kind of scale back. And then other times he was like, the percussion's not driving enough. And it was ironic because I had all these libraries and my computer setup now is literally like 500 of the setups I used to have, but at the same time, a sound is a sound. And the sounds that I was using back in the original series, they really spoke really well and they were very clear. They cut through really good. And so just because I'm putting like 10 layers of this and that on something, it doesn't mean that that's necessarily cutting through in doing the same job as the one layer that I did 20 years ago. So we were doing like a session where he was listening back to stuff that I did. It was actually the big scene where Dib is running away from Zim on the planets, and he's kind of jumping around and all that kind of stuff at towards the end of the Florpus. And he's like, it's just it needs to be more driving. It just needs to be kicking in more. And then we went to YouTube, and he like literally pulls up one of my songs from one of those sci-fi elements, like let's say Planet Jackers or something like that. He's like, see, like this. So he actually was using my own music sort of against me to inspire me to hit more of what we used to do in this new movie. So it was really challenging, but I also feel like I was able to push the sound forward and used a lot more synthesizers, and I used a lot of my own original samples and original sounds. It was just really fun to work on.
I watched actually your video about making the Florpus theme too, which I thought was a fun like behind the scenes.
Yeah, Jonan actually, that was another one where I had created a theme. And he's like, no, it should be more like this. So he's pretty musical actually. I don't know if he did it on his iPhone, his tablet, or his little computer, but he sent me kind of like an inspiration little ditty that he composed. And so then I just did something kind of similar to what he sent me, which probably would parlay into what you might want to be asking me about, which is the Piece Is Nice song.
That's
how that arose.
Absolutely. Yeah, that was like my next thing, literally. So what was the conversation for creating Piece Is Nice?
So Piece Is Nice, that was really interesting. So this involves lawyers. So the lawyers at Nickelodeon were so slow for some reason. So generally whenever songs are involved in animation or films, they're done first. So they reached out to me to just do the Piece Is Nice song. We got back to them, and then they never got back to us for like months upon months upon months. And Jonan just got tired of waiting around for me to write Piece Is Nice. So I think it was Jenny Goldberg, they did this little ditty of the main melody of Piece Is Nice, and they just kind of hummed it. And so that was what they used as placeholder when they were doing their animatic. And so what ended up happening was by the time I finally was able to work on Piece Is Nice and contractually everything was good, their temp placeholder was in there. So I took his melody that he wrote, and then I just did the arrangements and everything all around it and supplemented it so it sounded, the way he wanted it to sound. So that is a true collaboration between us, and we're co-composers on that music. And another funny story about that is my first version of Piece Is Nice sounded more like something that came out of the Macaulay Culkin Christmas movie. What's the name of that again?
Home Alone.
Home Alone, yeah. So it sounded like a really pretty John Williams piece that he wrote in Home Alone. Kind of had Celeste, and it was a little more pastoral and really pretty, and I love it. But like he's like, I love this, but it's not right. It's got to be like a huge anthem. It's got to be like something that would be playing in the baseball stadium. It's got to be just big and grand and epic. So I redid it with that, and I had to redo all the vocals too. And so maybe you noticed on the Piece Is Nice, but it's like a children's choir. So, and that children's choir is actually all of my kids. I have three kids, and two of my daughters were older, and my son was younger at the time. So maybe he was 10 or 11, and then my daughters were teenagers. So they would kind of change their voice slightly to make themselves sound a little bit younger. And then we had a friend of mine's kids come over, and so we would just multi-track over and over so that they eventually just sounded like this huge children's choir. So that was really fun and challenging too, because like I was thinking, man, that's gonna be quite the undertaking to get a children's choir to come and record this. And I was like, I think and in fact I'm on some of it, but I think I mostly turned down my stuff, but I'm sure I'm in there too, singing like a kid.
Nice. Oh, your kids did an amazing job. That's so cool. And, honestly, what's funny about Piece Is Nice is the fact that within the universe, it's Gurr who came up with it. So I like how it starts off silly and then just gets really beautiful with everyone singing.
Yeah, so the Gurr thing was funny because we actually had to do Gurr singing Well, then Gur sings along with Pieces Nice too, right? So the very beginning, the first Gur part was just him singing really bad, and then I just did the Pieces Nice theme, but just really terrible, like with really bad synthesizers and drums, and everything was off beat and everything. But then when we did the recording session for Gur singing along with my song, that was really challenging because Gur's voice is pitched. So we had to pitch my music up or down by the same amount of semitones that they pitch Gur's voice, so that when he sang to it and then they pitched him, it would all be correct when it's all final. So that was like a mathematical, twisty problem, but we laughed a lot at that session. That was so much fun.
I do also really love the song you have at the credits, because I know it's kind of like the theme song, that like all these things combined, right?
Yeah, that was super fun. So it was like the original Invader ZIM theme, the Irken theme, Pieces Nice, and what, am I forgetting anything?
Like
I think it was those
Florpus
three.
Too? Yeah.
Yeah, that was challenging. That was challenging, but really fun. And then up on YouTube, I have an extended version of those credits so people can hear, because I felt like I had to condense it, but I was able to, pull it out, make it longer.
I mean, honestly, I know there was recently like a Hey Arnold vinyl. There needs to be like an Invader ZIM vinyl. People would clamor for that, I think, honestly.
Yeah.
Yeah, for the music, for sure.
Yeah, there's been some talk. Nickelodeon's a little slow on wanting to release soundtracks, but there's been some talk. And then also, like there were times where, Nickelodeon went through just various executives at the top level. And at the time when Invader ZIM was being created, they were very excited about potentially it going into a series and being remade as a series. But by the end of the show, by the end of us finishing the show, the executive level of the various people at the top levels of executives had changed, so that sort of excitement had died down. And so it never really amounted to anything. But interestingly enough, I mean, I remember like Jonan talking to me a couple of times throughout the last 20 years of, oh, hey, they're interested. It might happen. It might turn into a series. And gosh, for all the amount of animation and reboots and everything that's going on these days, I just can't imagine a better show that could just be so much fun than Invader ZIM coming back.
I agree. And I think it was perfect, too, that Enter the Florpus ended up on Netflix. So I know there was the whole change in executives with Nickelodeon, because the same thing with the Rocco's movie ended up on Netflix. But yeah, I mean, here's hoping. You never know. I still would love to see more ZIM.
That's very possible. I mean, anything's possible. And, content is king. And it seems like everyone's looking for content.
Absolutely. And we're kind of like alluding to this, but since you've been in the industry so long, how would you say the industry has changed just in the past 20 years, the animation industry?
I mean, I think content just keeps getting better. You're able to do, for maybe around the same budgets, you're able to make things look even better because of computers and technology getting better. I just think that things are better, looking better. And I also think that animation seems to be less like a stepchild and more like a legitimate thing. And, with all of these streaming services now being here, and with the Disney Plus and HBO Max and, Netflix and Hulu, they're looking for so much content. And especially over COVID, animation was something that could be produced without a bunch of people in the same room together. So it just seems to be in a good stage these days.
Yeah, there's so much out there, and there's so many avenues, as you've alluded to as well, with, again, streaming, besides network and cable TV. Even actually, like, web series, I've noticed, are getting more and more prominent, which I think is really amazing. Like, indie animation, too, so that's really cool, honestly.
Yeah, like, is it Hell of a Boss?
Yes, yeah. Oh my god, I fell in love with that show recently, because Richard Horvitz, he's such a great show.
Has Been Hotel. Yeah, super awesome.
That's Vivian Medrano, Vivzy Pop.
Right.
So, yeah, you've touched on this as well, but I'll just ask it anyway. So, I'm curious to know, like, your thoughts about music in storytelling in general, and how you feel, like, the importance of music in storytelling, basically.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think, like, I see myself as part of the storytelling team. I also see see music as a character that's unseen, but is still present. And I think that silence as well as score really accentuate story and help tell the story. So I am all about, making sure the music matters. So let's not just have music, 100% of the time. Let's have it in the places that make most sense, and then let's get out when we don't need it. And let's not cheapen music by just having it constant.
And actually, I'm curious to know, like, what you do in the case of if you ever have. I mean, of course, you work with deadlines, but if you have creative block at all, and then do you kind of step away from a project, listen to maybe other things outside of what you're working on?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a little bit different every single time, but for me, what really is motivating is deadlines. So if I have a deadline on Friday and it's a Monday, what works for me really well is just seeing how much I need to write each day, and then just to be diligent to really do that. And like writing music is kind of like working out. It's or like, riding your bike, or other things that maybe are challenging at first, but then get easy as you do it every day. So it's like a muscle, it's a muscle memory kind of thing. So once you know your deadline and you have that motivation of hitting your deadline, and I'm not really one to wait till the last minute. So for me, I get excited about a deadline. I divide, the days I have until that deadline by that amount of days. And then if it's, 3 minutes a day, then I just get to it and write that 3 minutes a day. Now, I give myself some grace with that because, some days you're going to feel more motivated than others. Some days it's really hard to keep your butt in the chair. Other days you're like, wow, this is just so effortless. This went so quick and I'm done. And it's only 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And other days you're like, man, I didn't hit my deadline. So tomorrow morning I got to get up really early and, finish that music and then get started on the next set. So as far as creative writer block, I don't really have the full classic like writer's block. I think that, I know enough tricks and know enough things, and I have themes for so many of the characters that I can always just find something that will work. Some days you feel at the end of the day, you're like, oh man, I just really nailed it. Everything's perfect. Other days you're like, well, it's not the absolute best thing I've ever written, but it works. And then on a rare occasion, I might be just not happy with what I did, but I would say 95% of the time I'm really happy. I'm happy with what I've done. And then, there's that maybe 10% where you're just like, oh, that's the best thing I've ever done ever. So and like I said, you just kind of got to give yourself a little bit of grace and just not expect that every single thing you're going to do is the most amazing things, since sliced bread, because it just can't be, because there's so much music to write. It's not like, it's not like I'm a famous pop star and I have to write 3 big hits, because they get a year or longer to write their album, but I got to pump out, 15 to 18 minutes of music in a week. So it's a little bit different.
But that's true. It's like you're not going to love everything, but hopefully, as you mentioned, you love the majority of what you've done, so that's all that matters. And of course, like you have fun while you're creating music, so that's all that matters.
Yeah, exactly. Too. Yeah, It's a pretty fun job. It's I get to watch cartoons or watch people playing video games or play video games, for a living. So it's not bad.
This has been so much fun chatting with you, Kevin. But really, my last question I have for you is if you have any advice for aspiring composers.
Yeah, so I would say number one, you got to love writing music, and you have to really work hard at writing music and learning your craft. And in order to be a good composer, you have to obviously study and compose. But before you get to the point, I think, of composing, you also have to be a good musician. You don't have to be the most amazing musician, but you have to understand, an instrument and to be able to compose on that instrument. Most popular instruments for composers are piano as well as guitar. Now, I sit in front of my 88-key keyboard all day long because I have to input all those notes that you hear when you listen to my music. Every single one of those notes has been played in by me sitting in front of my computer, one note at a time. And then some of those have been played by musicians or myself playing playing different instruments. And so you have to be proficient with being able to convey your ideas into a digital audio workstation, or DAW, as we call them. And you have to also be really good at understanding current technology, being good with computers and being able to produce and to understand how to get the music to sound good. And so if you've got the composing down, you've got the musicianship down, you've got the technology and all the digital aspects of writing music, then you got to you take that hat off and you got to put on a different hat, and that's the hat of businessman. You have to be good with networking, good with people. You have to have good people skills. You have to understand how to go into a meeting and not be like, demanding that you're the artiste and that things have to go your way. You have to be able to be a team player and work with other people and have them respect you, have mutual respect for them and them to respect you, and to find together a good creative vision. So there's that. And then there's just also just kind of like what we were just talking about was, can you, once you get that job, once you're able to communicate good with the people who you're working with, can you now deliver on what you promised? Can you write 3 minutes of music a day and hit that deadline in 2 weeks for that short film you're writing the music for? And can you deliver the right specs to the people needing the music that are going to do the mixing? So there's a lot of hats that you wear, and I've realized that over the years that it's a very nuanced job. It's not just about writing the music. It's not just about the production of the music. It's not just about the networking and getting the job. It's not just about being self-motivated and finishing the music. It's all of those things all have to go into, the formula of what it takes to be a good composer.
Absolutely. So yeah, the talent, creativity, but also the work ethic for sure. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, Kevin, this has been absolutely wonderful. Please let everyone know where they can find you on social media and your current projects that you'd like to promote.
Sure, yeah. So I'm on Instagram at Kevin Manthei Music. It's Manthei, Manthei Music. And then that's the same for Facebook. It's Kevin Manthei Music. SoundCloud, I believe I'm just Kevin Manthei. And Twitter, I'm Kevin Manthei. But I'm most happy on Instagram, so I'd love for people to follow me there. I like to post my little experiments. I like to create my own sounds and my own libraries. I'm always posting little snippets of what I'm working on and little interesting experiments I'm doing, and a little bit of my personal life, like what's, things about my studio and family and just various things that are going on. So Kevin Manthei Music on Instagram is probably a great place to start.
Perfect. Cool. And then what you're currently working on as well?
Yes, so I just finished writing a bunch of episodes for a reboot of the VeggieTales series. And I'm working with Alan Iterio, who has a company called AI Animation, and he's out of Mexico City. And they've been creating a show called Villainous, which plays a little bit of an homage to Invader ZIM in some regards, that the main character is an anti-hero, and his name's Black Hat. And it's a very successful show. Where it's going to be streaming will be announced hopefully shortly. We've been working on the first season. I've scored thus far a ton of shorts for it and like 5 11-minute episodes. But it's based through Cartoon Network. So, that it might end up on Cartoon Network Latin America, might end up Cartoon Network here, or maybe, even HBO Max, because it's, now that they're part of that Warner Brothers and whatnot. So there's that, and then I am probably the most main composer on a couple of video games, which is Neverwinter, based on the Dungeons and Dragons. Neverwinter is an MMO, and then the other MMO I work on is Star Trek Online. So I've been writing a lot of music for both of those for the past actually 10 years. So they keep creating new content each year, and I keep writing new music for those. So that's what is keeping me busy, and then I'm up for a bunch of different animated shows and stuff I can't talk about at the moment. But so never a dull moment around here.
And with that, that is going to conclude this week's episode of Storytelling Saga. Be sure to visit storytellingsaga.com for all places to listen and where to follow on social media. And as always, feel free to send me any questions, comments, or writing prompts by sending me an email at storytellingsaga@gmail.com. Next episode, I am so excited to say that I will be interviewing another person who worked on Invader ZIM, none other than writer Eric Trueheart. He wrote some of the best episodes of the series, including, of course, Zim Eats Waffles. He also wrote the medium-sized book of Zim scripts, an absolutely fantastic book I highly recommend to any Zim fan. So I'm so excited to chat with him. It's going to be a lot of fun. Until then, thank you for listening, and remember, write what you love. And also remember that peace is nice. Peace is better than chicken and rice.